You talked about Canada's last wrongs, the past things they haven't done right. When will you speak out about the 20 vandalized churches? They're burning churches and vandalizing them, and you're not calling it a hate crime.
Old. Love it. This is a story that's not getting nearly enough attention, and we're going to stay on it because it's bad enough that it's happening in Canada, but I predict it's going to be happening here. Let's talk to that woman right there who was pushed away by his bodyguards, Drea Humphrey. She's a British Columbia-based journalist for Rebel News. Drea, how are you?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
I'm very glad you're here. Thanks for getting the word out. What's the latest number of how many churches, how many Christian churches you know that have been burned to the ground?
You know, it's hard to keep track, but the last time I looked at it just yesterday, it was over 22 churches burnt or vandalized in less than a month.
Amazing. Any idea has anyone been caught, or are we just speculating? You know, I think we know who's doing it, but anyone caught yet?
Well, here's the thing, in case anybody doesn't know, the first couple of churches to burn took place on First Nation band land after there had been discovery of mass graves around residential schools. Now, the first person to be caught, however, had absolutely nothing to do with First Nations. They were a white individual in Alberta. So that's the first person to go into custody. More recently, there has been another person caught, and it was a child, an Indigenous child on a reserve.
That's it. That's all we've gotten so far out of the 22 churches.
I should
you mentioned
add,
the mass
sorry,
graves.
Sorry,
Go
there
ahead.
were a couple of vandals. There's a video near me in Vancouver, BC, of a couple of vandals throwing orange paint on a church in Vancouver, and the women, appear to be white women as well.
Okay. You mentioned the mass graves. Give us the true story about what these really are.
So I did an investigative report where I went to the first discovery of the mass graves, and I do the quotation marks because they're not discoveries. They are grave sites that are unmarked, that have been known about for years. There's reports on them. They're not a surprise. Many of them had markings before, but because they were small wooden crosses over the time, they have, deteriorated and been gone. So basically, it's the locating of grave sites that were known about, and individual grave sites. They were reported by media as a mass grave of children. However, the technology that was used to do this, it's not a cut science. So to say, there's 215 children buried under the ground here is quite a statement to make.
Well, the mass graves too, that creates this vision of a giant hole with bodies just thrown in it.
Right.
But it sounds like what they really found was a grave site, or was a graveyard, which, that's a normal thing. But what are these residential schools? Because this is also a very dystopian picture that could be painted. So my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you had these Christian missionaries or Christian groups, Catholic Church, come in and set up these schools to try to westernize and Christianize, evangelize the locals. And of course, the media's representation is that these were very poorly run and the rest. What's the truth?
Well, that's, pretty accurate. There is lots of evidence to support that there was very poor living conditions in many of these residential schools. Also, you had things like tuberculosis going around. So you had, people, all sorts of people dying. In the first location in Kamloops, there's a whole town set up about 20 minutes away from there, which was a whole town set up for people dying of tuberculosis. So you had things like that. There has been reports of both physical and sexual abuse that took place at these places. So there were some horrific things. Children were taken from their families, whether it was willing or not. On the flip side, there are some people who you can find that will say residential school was a great time for them. It was something they were happy to have. So there's definitely mixed reports on that, but there is no contesting that there were abuses and some horrible things that took places at these schools.
So all that being said, why now burn down churches? And what has the government's reaction been to the burning down of these churches?
Well, there's supposed to be a call for truth and reconciliation, a recognition that this has happened. That's what many from the First Nation community are asking for. And then, making sure it's not happening. So when you ask why are churches burning down, that's has nothing to do with reconciliation. In fact, there are many Indigenous leaders that are saying this should not be happening. These churches are burning on their own reserve land. They were attended willingly by Indigenous Christians when they were open. Even recently, they are almost all attached grave sites where Indigenous people are buried, where you go to mourn a loved one, not to mention the risk they are posing in the middle of summer of going up in flames to the whole entire neighborhood. So when you ask why are these churches burning, to me, it seems like to cause the opposite of reconciliation, which would be division, pitting people against each other, and of course, another opportunity to attack the Christian faith, which we're seeing more and more. I'm not sure if you are aware of the pastors our country has thrown in prison for preaching the gospel in person during COVID-19.
Wow, that was deep and insightful. I want more of that. Like, subscribe, get more.